Welcome back to your weekly dose of encouragement on the Unashamedly You podcast. If you are enjoying this podcast, we would be honored if you would go and leave us a review on the platform that you are listening on, and make sure to tag us when you share us to your social media. Anytime that you send us a message and let us know which episode has helped or encouraged you, we always make sure that your feedback gets passed along. There is no community like a community of kingdom-minded women running after their calling and purpose. Hello and welcome to the Unashamedly You podcast, a space to enlighten, encourage, and empower you to go out and unashamedly be who God is calling you to be. I am your host, Jamie Herndon. I pray you hear less of me and more of Him as you listen to today's episode. Let's grow together. Good friends introduce you to more good friends. I've actually heard our guest today speak before at ladies' conferences, but I am friends with the Ziegler family, and they introduced us. So we have a personal connection now, and we have tried for a few months to get her on the podcast. Our schedules worked out this week to be able to have her on. Tejuana Johnson, wow, what an incredible honor to have you on the Unashamedly You podcast today. If you'll just take a moment and introduce yourself to our guest before we get started.
Thank you, Sister Jamie. I am, like you said, I'm Tejuana Johnson. I am married to Jim Johnson. We have been pastoring in Natchez, Mississippi for 22 years now. We have one adult daughter. Before we pastored, we did evangelize for 7 years. We pastored another church in North Carolina, and we were on staff of a couple of different churches. I love to travel. That would be my favorite thing to do. I've been able to go to some pretty neat destinations. I love to travel. I love to read biographies is my deal. It's probably why I like your podcast so much, because it's kind of like picking the brains of people and getting inside their heads and seeing kind of what made them who they are or gave them success in their field. So that's basically it.
I love that as well. And one thing that I have learned through this podcast and then talking about loving biographies is it's truly, you can't read a book by its cover. And so like getting to find out who people are and how they were raised, things about them that honestly, just looking at them today, you would never know. Talking about that, why don't we start with you sharing your personal testimony and a little bit of how you were raised?
I was raised in truth. Thank God. I'm grateful for it. I don't take it for granted one day of my life. I was, as they say, fourth generation apostolic Pentecostal. My great grandfather was an old time pioneer in East Texas. My grandfather was a pioneer, started churches. My dad was a pastor. I received the Holy Ghost at age 10, loved living for God. I'm thankful for things that were put deep, deep inside of me. When I was 16, my parents, my dad was also a pastor. When I was 16, my parents divorced. And I don't say this to bring any kind of shame or whatever to them. It's just an event in my life that did happen. I love my parents very well, very good. But it was a big moment. And so when I was 16, my world was just kind of rocked. But I remember a defining moment that happened in church when I was 17 years old. And it just, at that moment, something just cemented in my spirit, in my heart, to where I knew the way I was raised, the truth that was put into me about the Word of God was right. And I determined at that point, this is my life. This is the way I want to live. If I have children, this is the way I want to raise my children in truth. I guess I could say, sis, that I fell in love with it at that point. It was such a deep experience. I can't even describe it. And it just forever settled my mind about truth and about holiness and godliness and the Word of God. And so that was just the moment for me. And then I met my husband, and God gave me the right person for me. And my life, I feel like, has just been a series of miracles, a series of moments that I'm so grateful for. I wouldn't want to live any other way.
Talking about your parents divorcing whenever you were older, that is something that it isn't always talked about or discussed is and then meeting your husband. Coming from a somewhat broken home myself, I know that there's a fear that comes with that, with once you go to get married and then raising your own children, fearing that you might experience the same things that your parents did. So what are some things that you've done to overcome that, to overcome those fears and ensure that your marriage is not just another one of those statistics?
Well, I remember, this probably sounds so odd, but I remember being 16, 17 years old, and I would read books about marriage. I would just listen to radio. I remember, everybody's probably heard of Dr. James Dobson and Focus on the Family. And it's funny, but at 16, 17, I was an avid listener to that radio program. I wouldn't miss it. And I would listen to all of his radio programs about marriage, and I would read books. I read all of Dobson's books at 16, 17. That probably sounds so weird, but I just wanted to learn as much as I could. And I would watch, people in the church that seemed to have worked, through their issues or whatever. And I would watch them and just kind of observe what they did. And again, this is not derogatory against my parents. It was an event that happened. And so it did put a lot of fear in me. Like, what if I choose the wrong person? That was my main thing. Oh my goodness. And I prayed a lot. Even as a teenager, I would just say, God, please help me to make the right decision when that time comes, that this is the right choice. And then I think too, Sister Jamie, desire. Just having desire. Desire will motivate you, and it will push you to find answers, to find knowledge that you need to make the right decisions for your future. And I would just say that's how I dealt with it, was just through desire, reading, observation, and filling my head with knowledge that hopefully would help me in the future when those decisions did come my way.
I know that you're really passionate about marriages. You talk about going to different churches and doing marriage retreats and all those things. But marriage in the church is often under attack for a reason. Strong marriages build strong churches. And let's talk about what role that marriage really does play into the church.
You could go all kinds of ways on this, but stability produces more stability. And the church is a place of healing. The church is a place of a sanctuary for broken people, to come in, and we welcome people with issues and problems. That's what the gospel is all about. But when you have stable families, it provides an example, you know, for those that are coming in full of dysfunction, and they don't know how to have healthy families. They don't know how to have a healthy marriage. But when you've got people there that are living that, it provides connection between the younger generation, the older generations, connections, somebody to mentor and model God's perfect plan for marriage. And yes, things happen, divorce happens, things happen that uh, people can't control, but God's plan is still, one man, one woman for life. And some people just they haven't seen that model. They don't know what that looks like. And so if you've got a church full of strong families that are teaching other families how to be strong, how to live, it prevents a lot of hurt and a lot of dysfunction in future generations when people know how to correctly operate in their finances. Some people and young people today, so many of them haven't been taught how to how to how to budget, how to do things. A lot of things are not even spiritual, they're just practical. And when you've got families that are living those things out, it just provides so much stability for future generations and prevents hurt in future generations. That's the best way I would describe it.
That is so true. And I know with Matt and I have talked about many times the things that we've learned. Someone asked him not too long ago, they're like, how do you know about business success and how do you know about, and he's like, everything that we know how to do, that we know how to do correctly, we have learned it from the church.
Yes.
Business, finances, our marriage, how to raise our children, everything that we have learned and how we do things is from the church.
Yes.
And
That's so good.
What advice would you give to couples navigating the pressures of ministry and balancing family life? And then, as when we say ministry, it can be choir, Sunday school. There's a lot of things that go into ministry, and of course, ministers themselves.
Well, speaking to ministers themselves and ministry families, I remember something that one of the ministers said at our wedding 36 years ago. I've been married 36 years. That sounds so ancient. But anyway, I remember him saying this and it stuck in my mind. And he called our names and he said, "You will find throughout time that people will come to respect your ministry and what you say according to the quality of your marriage." And that I'll never forget that. Bam. And I believe that that's true for ministry families, because how are you going to help them have a good marriage if they sense unrest in yours? And people can sense that. And then continuing to talk about ministry families, one thing that I believe in is that your family, your children need to know that they come before your ministry, before your church. God created the family before he ever did the church. And I know that's been said, but it is so true. We always made it a point. And again, I want to say this. I feel like I have to qualify this. Anytime that I'm asked to talk about family or talk about marriage, speak on the subject, I want to do a disclaimer, because it kind of sets you up like you're the expert. Well, I know it all. I have all the answers. I don't know it all. I've made mistakes. I am not a perfect parent. I'm not a perfect wife. But all I'm doing is sharing things that I've observed and learned along the way. And one thing that we did that I believe was very advantageous was our daughter knew. We only have one daughter, one child. Our daughter knew that once a week, Thursday night, that was family night, that was family time. Dad wasn't going to accept calls from anybody for that space, those few hours. And that was her time with us when she was little growing up. And we guarded that religiously. We protected that because we wanted her to know, hey, we're busy. Yes, mom and dad have to do all these things, but you know what? You're the most important thing in our world. And I believe that, or I've observed that so many, especially young preachers and their wives, they feel like they just got to be Superman, Superwoman, meeting everybody's needs all the time. And sometimes their family gets left behind in that. And I think in ministry, that has got to be protected and it's got to be vocalized to their children. I think that is so helpful to let them know we're not going to save the world and leave you behind. Because when we get to the end of our lives, when I'm old and I don't think I'll be in a nursing home, but if I were, the saints are probably not going to be the ones that come visit me. Hopefully it will be my daughter, my grandchildren. And investing in that is so important. Creating memories. I think that's great. And as far as other types of ministry in the church, it is hard sometimes to find balance because we are all so busy, just running crazy. So I would just say to guard that time religiously, carve out a time for family time. and treat it like you would any other appointment. It's an appointment. Uh, uh, well, you make appointments to go to the dentist, the doctor. That's my appointment, and that's how we looked at it. That is our appointment on this certain day of the week. We don't do anything else, but we spend time with family.
So many good things in there, but especially like making it an appointment and sticking to it. Like it's one thing to
Yes.
say, we're going to make family time on this day, but I mean, it is life. Things come up, things happen, but making sure that they know they're more important. And I know that that had to be helpful to your daughter. I've heard a lot of ministers' wives that come on here and talk and say that it's so important because maybe they were raised in a generation where they didn't come first, and then the hurt that it created.
Yes. Yes.
So knowing how important that is. I know you're
Yes.
also passionate about encouraging moms and mothers and to I know that you're also passionate about encouraging mothers to pass on truth to the next generation. I love this about you and love all the things that we had talked about before on that. Can you share some of the ways that you've done that and how you encourage other moms to do the same?
I sure can, sis. And I want to tell you something. This is my passion right here. This is my passion. Intentional parenting. Intentional parenting. And it goes back to some things that we said earlier when you feel like you're overwhelmed. I never was a kid person growing up. I never was a babysitter. I wasn't one that always went around holding the babies. And so then all of a sudden you have a baby and you're sitting there and you're looking at this human being and you're thinking, oh my word, their life is in my hands. I'm responsible not just for their physical needs, but certainly everything spiritual or intellectual, anything that comes into them. And so I tell you what, before I ever had a child, this is kind of funny, but my husband and I were newlyweds, and I didn't have my daughter till I was 28 and a half. I mean, I was older, but I was about 21 or 22. Somebody gave me a bag of cassette tapes that totally dates me. But anyway, and in this bag of cassette tapes, there was a tape that was entitled Mothering. I thought, and it listed, several pastors' wives that were speaking. And I thought, well, I'll pop that in. And one of the speakers on this tape was Sister Mary Wilson from Sacramento, California. And she was talking about something that I found out later is a real thing, and that is parental peer pressure. And she was saying, God gave that child to you and nobody else. And if you succumb to parental peer pressure when you're praying for the wisdom daily to raise that child, no, most people aren't praying for your wisdom to raise your child. They're praying for wisdom to raise theirs. But you only get one shot at it. And if you don't follow the wisdom God gives you, it could be disaster. And I just latched onto that. And when I had our daughter, I just thought that's going to be my policy. I don't care what other people say about how I parent, what people think I should or shouldn't do, as long as I'm in a place of prayer and I'm asking God daily. And I did, and I still do, even though she's an adult now, I still ask God for wisdom. And if people didn't like the decisions that I made or the places I said she could or couldn't go, the standards that we set in our home, then that was okay with me. They didn't have to like it because I found out that God really does give you wisdom for your child, for their personality. And it's so I feel like being set free from that parental peer pressure really helped me to just, I put blinders on and said, I got one shot. And so some things I did will probably sound silly to other people. But that's fine. And, Sister Jamie, I just was so conscious about it, probably to the point of obsession. But I thought, as long as I am the number one influence in her life, I'm going to fill that little head with a certain kind of music, with thoughts, with programs. When I would get up in the morning or get her up immediately, I would turn on, I don't know if this is so old, but the Cedar Mont Kids. They were these little songs that children sang, and just fun little songs. And I would start the day and I would put those on while she was eating breakfast. That would be playing in the background. And as she would play throughout the day, I would listen to things that I wanted her to hear and act like it was I wanted to hear them. But I wanted that to be going in her brain. And she would look like she was not paying a bit of attention over here on the floor with her toys or her dolls or whatever. But then later on in the week, something would come up in conversation and she would say something about it. I thought, my goodness, that was just a sermon that I was listening to, but she uh, chimed in on it. And some just little things. I was trying to create a mindset. And for example, like, and I know there's controversial things about Barbie dolls, but she had Barbie dolls, okay? And I would take those pants that were on those Barbies and I would make them into skirts. And some people might think, and they looked horrible. They weren't professionally done, but I would cut them and I would say, oh, you know what? Let's make her into a good apostolic Pentecostal Barbie. And that may sound so silly to some people. I would take their jewelry off and, but I just wanted to condition her spirit and her mind. This is how we do things. We don't do things like that. I never allowed for play jewelry, things like that. I never allowed her to play with it. And some parents say, oh, they're just playing. But I just didn't want any kind of a seed of desire for that to be planted into her heart and mind, because little girls tend to love bling bling. And I guess that's what I'm talking about as far as intentional parenting. Just a very concentrated, focused effort that while I can, I am going to create a mindset and an environment. Because you know what? We know that there will be a day when our voice is not the loudest in their ears. And I remember praying a prayer. I remember this just as like it were yesterday. When I was rocking her, she was just a few days old. And I remember praying to God, just weeping and weeping. Of course, some of it was probably hormones, but some of it is that feeling of responsibility. And I remember praying, and if this was such a specific prayer, I was sharing this with a young mother a couple of weeks ago, and she told me, you need to share that. And so I will. But I prayed and I said, God, one day my voice may not be enough. And when that time comes, God, would you place people in her life that will speak the things that she needs to hear? Most likely through those teen years, sometimes, and she was never rebellious or anything like that, but I'm just saying they still need to hear other voices sometimes. And I've watched God do that throughout her life. When my voice needed to be confirmed, our teachings needed to be confirmed, I've watched God use other people to step in and say those things as well. And I just want to encourage young mothers. One more thing, now a lot of people talk about it, that, one thing we decided was no sleepovers because, and that was, like I said, back when they weren't such a deal, everybody wasn't really talking about it. But I just felt, and after praying, I just thought, I'm going to control her environment as much as I can. It goes back to that. And it only takes one time, Sister Jamie, of something to happen at somebody else's house, an unsaved relative or somebody to come into that home and you can't control it. And they may be exposed to something or experience something. We've all heard stories that will affect them harmfully for the rest of their life. And I never wanted to take a chance on that happening. She could go to parties until it was bedtime. Then bedtime, you're coming home with me. And just little things. And I want to encourage young mothers to not be intimidated, to stand up for what they believe God is calling them to do with regard to their child. It's so important to be intentional. Fill their heads with music, fill their heads with sermons, programs. I never put anything on accidentally. The car is a good place to control what they listen to when they're little. You know, if you want to have something on that, you know, and I remember putting on classic sermons by men of God. You know, Brother Morton, Just Let It Unfold, just different things I would have on in the house because I wanted her to grow up with a familiarity of those classic things, those precious things that I wanted to be a part of her. So I hope that answers that question.
I think one thing that I think about is creating an environment of truth where they learn to love it. Like
Yes.
that's my biggest prayer for my girls is I don't ever want it to look like that anything I do is a burden.
Yes. Can I say something right here, Sister Jamie? That I meant to say something about that. That is so important. I'm so passionate about that too, because the way we present it and the way we live it is so vital to that mindset because I wanted her to view living for God, our consecrations, as a privilege, as very joyful. Um, I remember one little thing, it's become a family joke now, but one little thing I did when she was growing up. Again, I don't know where it came from. It's just, I don't know. But anyway, we would be driving to Walmart or whatever. And if I found a parking space that was right up front, I would we would pull in. I would say, "Oh, look at this. We pay our tithes, and God gives us these amazing blessings." And so we would, next week be at Walmart. If I found a good parking place, I would say, look at what God did for us. We pay our tithes, we serve Him, and He has provided us the best parking space. And so now it just became a thing. Every now and then we'll be looking for a good parking place at Christmas time. We find a good one. She'll say, we pay our tithes. It's just kind of become a funny thing, but presenting it so positive that, and you know what? My parents presented it that way to me. It was like, there was nothing, it's like, why wouldn't you want to live for God? Why wouldn't you want to live holy? I can remember being out in public sometime, and if we saw somebody, maybe a homeless person or somebody that was obviously a drug addict or something like that. Another thing, intentional. I remember looking and saying, "Honey, look at that. Look how sad that is. My goodness, that's what happens when people don't serve the Lord. Look at what happens." But we don't have to experience that because we serve the Lord. We know Jesus. And so, yes, presenting that in a positive light. And I tell moms, when you're doing your hair, when you're doing your long hair, don't let your daughters hear you say, "Oh, this hair. I am so sick of doing this hair." That's a negative thing. And I've caught myself doing that in years past, like, "Oh," and then immediately said, "You know what? I'm so thankful that I have hair to fix." Some people don't have hair. Maybe they have cancer. Everything goes back to that intentional, giving it a positive spin. When we've been on trips or vacations, I remember just pointing out, look how good God has been to us. This, God is just any way to promote positivity. I agree with that, Sister Jamie. Never do what you do. Never do what you do without them feeling like it's a joy for you to do it. It is a joy. I remember when she would get, our daughter would get money or Christmas money or whatever, and let's say she got $5, and we would make a big deal. You get to put money in the tithing envelope and take it up there yourself. And we'd count out the 50 cents and 25 cents offering and do that to her. It was, oh, she could not wait to march up there with it. There's just so many little things that you can do. And I feel like that I've been rambling, but I hope that helps.
That's so good. And it is a privilege. And
Mhm.
putting that in our children's heart and making them think that. One thing that I feel like maybe is lacking in our generation of parenting, and I don't know, this just could be my observation of some things, but it just feels like there's just not a strong fear of the Lord and a reverence for the things of God. I feel like that we were taught a healthy dose of fear, and it's something, honestly, I hold dear. I do not regret the things that I heard Grandma Holmes when she was talking about hell and me looking up and seeing the moon, being a little bit
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
immediately repenting.
No.
I don't regret feeling that way or, about ministry and knowing, that there were she bears out there and you just didn't talk about the ministry because they could come up. And I had that healthy dose of the fear of the Lord. But then sometimes it almost seems like with our generation of parenting, it's like you don't want to teach any fear at all. You don't want them to fear anything. How do you think that we could instill that reverence in our children? Because that's something I want my children to have a fear of the Lord and a reverence for the things of God.
You know, um, it's been said before, and I believe it to be true, that the climate of the world that we live in somewhat affects the climate of the church. And we live in a very irreverent world where there is no fear of God anymore. And that you mentioned preaching about, or the preaching about hell and things like that. And I remember my husband preaching a revival at a church, and he preached that night about hell and being ready for the coming of the Lord. And we've got to be ready. And there were about 6 or 7 little children that night that were just, they flooded the altars and they were just pouring their little hearts out to God, just crying and praying for the Holy Ghost. And the next day, this is just so unbelievable to me. But the next day, the pastor talked to my husband and he said that a lot of the parents were upset about it and that he had put such fear and the little children weren't able to sleep that night and their little darlings weren't able to, you know, quit thinking about it. And he didn't really want him preaching like that anymore. And I was just astonished because that's the kind of preaching I grew up on, you know? And God is love. But there is a very healthy fear of God and reverence that we have got to somehow instill into our children. And I think it's preaching about the coming of the Lord and preaching about, yes, God is a God of love, but there are consequences to sin. And I think we've got to preach those consequences and make them very well known to our children. I know what you mean. And I've wondered that myself, Sister Jamie. Where did that come from in us, that healthy fear? I think some of it comes from how we see those that we respect and we look up to, how they interact with God and in church and the things they say. I think those around me had a healthy respect and a fear for God. So maybe that was just something that was more caught than taught. But that is a need, and I do know that that is a situation today.
I think some of it comes from also, that there's so much parenting and marriage information readily available through the internet.
Yeah. Yeah.
It full social media is full of advice on how to raise your children
Yeah.
and on how things to do in your marriage and all the things. Every psychiatrist you've ever met, I feel like, is on social media and on YouTube, and they just got it ready and they know exactly what to say. And a lot of what they're talking about is not biblical.
Right.
But a lot of us moms that are trying to raise our children apostolic, but we're also feeding ourselves some of this that's online and on social media. And it's just it's something that even with myself, I'm not talking about anybody else. I'm just talking about myself here. But it's easy to get caught up in those things, and it's easy to get caught up in, you know, the gentle parenting and, not offending your children, not upsetting your children. And I think a lot of it comes from that. I feel like a lot in my generation. And maybe I'm sunning around on that as well, but it's so hard to talk about without other people getting upset.
I agree because we live in a culture of political correctness. There is such a spirit of offense that is out there. And I think that's a lot of it. We are so worried about offending people. And I'm not saying that we should not ever have any thought that we should be careful. That shouldn't be our goal, obviously, to offend people. But we do live in that kind of a generation where you just, tiptoe through the tulips, scared of hurting people. And, well, don't say that, don't say this. But, it comes down to you just have to speak truth. You just have to speak truth. And, yeah, I wasn't raised with anyone worrying about offending me, you know? And I'm glad I wasn't. I'm glad I wasn't, but we've got to get over that worry about offending people because when you love someone, you will love them enough to offend them sometimes. Speak the truth in love. So an open rebuke is better than secret love. That's what the scripture says. Now, we could probably unpack a lot on what that means, but I won't be the one to do that. But we've got to speak the truth in love. And if it offends, well, they need to read that scripture in Psalms that says, "Great peace have they that love thy law, and nothing shall offend them."
It does. It just feels like that, people talk about church mothers and that a church mother, I don't remember my grandmother worried about being offensive at all.
Right.
But even Grandma Holmes, like there's things that she said to me, and I thank God for bold truth that she said. I mean, it saved me. It saved my soul. It helped me marry the right person. Like it's helping me as a mom. And how do you think that we could bring that kind of mentorship back into the church? Because I feel like it's needed and I'm hungry for it. I want it. But I think there's not a lot of it being given as much because people are so worried about being, offending someone.
Yeah. Uh, Something you said triggered a memory. When I was about 20 years old, there was a leader in my life that offended me, but they loved me enough to tell me something about some of my insecurities. And they asked if they could talk to me. They were bold enough to ask if they could talk to me. And I said, sure. It was not a family member. It was not my pastor, just a leader in the church. And they said, I've noticed this, this, and this about you. And then they begin to just, eat me alive. I felt like at the time, and tell me what I needed to do to change. And when they got finished and I walked away, I'm not going to lie. I was very upset. I had tears in my eyes, but I want you to know that that piece of advice that they gave me literally changed me. And I've told the story in great detail through the years. It was a defining moment when someone loved me enough to tell me the truth. And I value that today, even though at the time I was a little miffed. I thank God that they stepped out of their comfort zone and told me the truth. And as far as churches today and mentorship, I would love to see. I think it would be great to have sessions, kind of like fireside chats, where you organize things and bring some of these elder moms and elder dads together and just have sessions, just very relaxed, where you can ask questions. They can give things that they have learned through the years, give nuggets of wisdom. I really don't know of a perfect way to do it, but I'm just thinking that that would be a resource in a way that, maybe once a quarter, just have a night where you can just get words of wisdom from those that have experienced more than we have.
I would love that. I try to do these fireside chats with podcasts. I ask questions that but it's
Exactly.
so true. I just, as a mom and raising your children, there are a lot of good things that are out there on the internet. There's no doubt about it. But there's a lot of stuff that I look at and I'm like, but, there's nothing like hearing something from an anointed woman
Exactly.
of God, man of God that's coming and telling you something that is not to tickle your ear, that is not to make you feel good, that is not to make you feel normal, which is what everyone wants. Everyone wants to feel, oh, well, I'm just normal. But
Yeah.
sometimes I don't want to just hear that what I'm doing is all perfect and roses. I want to hear what I can do better.
Right. And it's just information overload. We live in that era. And you're right. And this one will present as the authority on this one, this subject. This one will present as the authority on that. And it can be just such an overload of information. But I agree. If we could just, and so I found that people are intimidated to ask questions. Even if we could do it where it was submit your questions on paper and have these nights where we can come together and just answer those questions, but where no one will feel intimidated or embarrassed to publicly ask their questions.
True. I know that you have a powerful testimony about your daughter and about her almost dying. Would you mind sharing that story? And I also wanted to ask, did that experience change the way that you parented? Were there things that you had done beforehand that you said, thank God I did? And did you have anything that you're like, man, I wish I would have done this?
Yes, Sister Jamie, as a matter of fact, my daughter, what makes this just so unbelievable and so amazing is my daughter actually did die, and the Lord raised her from the dead. And I'm leaving out a lot, but it was the Sunday after peak uh, of 23. It was July 23rd of 2023. And she was scheduled to go home with the group from our church that came. My husband and I had been asked to preach a weekend, the weekend after peak in Racine, Missouri. We'd never been there. I mean, we knew the pastor, we were acquainted, but, had never been there, weren't real close friends or anything like that. And at the last minute, my husband just felt really impressed that she should come with us. So he made arrangements, and she does the music at our church. So he made other arrangements, and she came with us. We had a great service Sunday morning. Sunday night, we were in the service, and the pastor called us up to the platform. He was going to have us sing. And so we were walking up to the platform. I was in front of her, and all of a sudden, I heard her call out to me. And she said, Mom, I feel like I'm going to faint. And she was gripping the rail. And just as I turned around, she immediately collapsed in the floor. And I just instinctively knew this is something different. This is serious. And the church was full that night. There was probably about 250, 300 people there. And I remember I called out and I said, I need help. And I looked over. My husband and the pastor had heard her fall, and they jumped up and they came running, and she was just non-responsive. And so I remember most things. I don't remember this. Somebody told me I screamed, somebody pray, somebody pray. And then I remember screaming, I need help, I need help. And then I remember saying, "Oh, God, I plead your blood. I plead the blood of Jesus." So we rushed to where she was, and there were 3 nurses in the church that came running to help assist and to assess what was going on. My husband and the pastor were there, and she was just totally non-responsive. We had no idea what was going on. And so the nurses began to try to find a pulse, and they could not find a pulse. And the assistant pastor he came running. He was holding her head in his hands because of the way she fell. Her head was kind of tilted down, but he was holding his head in her hands. And he told me later, he said, "I felt when her body went totally cold under my hands." And one of the nurses also told me later, he said, she said, "I felt her skin when it went totally ice cold." And so somebody in my periphery, I heard somebody say, "I'll call the ambulance." It's a very rural church, so I didn't know how long it was gonna take for the ambulance to get there. So the nurses in the meantime are beginning to work on her. And the church, Sister Jamie, one of the most precious sounds I've ever heard, that church began to lift up a roar. And when I say a roar, it was a roar of intercessory prayer for my daughter. And I'm in shock. My husband is weeping. She's blue. And my husband and the pastor got down and laid hands on her head and began to pray. No response, nothing. And so all of this chaos is just going on around me. And I remember someone brought a chair, said, "You need to sit down." I remember someone else in the church saying, "Don't look at her. You don't want to remember her like this." And when they said that, it's like bells went off in my head. Like, what are you saying? And I said, "No, get out of the way. I, I, I want to see what's going on." And so um, I remember there were some musicians, some gentlemen that had been on the platform, guitar players, whatever. I remember them stretching their bodies prostrate on the floor and just calling out to God and saying, "God, raise her up. God, raise her up." And then I'm also thinking, what's happening? You're in such shock when stuff like this is happening. And so then the nurses began to do CPR and mouth to mouth, that whole thing. They began to do the chest compressions, and there was just nothing there. And I'm thinking, what is your mind is just bombarded with, "Oh my goodness, how are we going to face this? What is happening? Why did this happen?" And so they continued to work on her. Somebody produced a defibrillator. It was not a working order. And so that was kind of like a dead end. The church is still praying. And like I said, at that time, I did not know that she was cold. But I knew that she was gone. It was just, I knew it. I could look at it and see what was happening. And I also saw one of the nurses kind of indicate to the pastor that they had done all they could do. And so this is over a process of about 10 to 12 minutes that all this is happening. And my thought was, and this may be correct or incorrect, but my thought was, if she lives, she's been like this so long, there's going to be severe brain damage. And so I'm just thinking all of these thoughts. Well, the paramedics finally got there. And so while they were moving in the side door of the church to take control of the situation, the church is still praying. And I mean, they were interceding on her behalf. She all of a sudden coughed and did more like a gasp. And I remember thinking at that point, well, there's some breath. She's breathing again. And one of the nurses began to just pound the floor and say, breathe, 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 when they finally saw that breath. And then she began to have a grand mal seizure. She had never had a seizure before, ever. But I thought, well, she's breathing. So that's something. And so she went into this terrible seizure. It was so tough to watch. And so the paramedics took over and they began to try to stabilize her. They took her to the ambulance and we got in the pastor's car and followed the ambulance. I'm leaving a lot out, but we followed the ambulance to the hospital in Joplin, Missouri. And when we got there, of course, we're just not knowing. They said she was very agitated in the ambulance and just not knowing what the future held. So we got there, waited a while, and a nurse came back, and finally, after about 20 or 30 minutes, they said, one parent can come back. And so I went back there with her. When I walked in the room where they had her, trying to stabilize her, they were trying to assess what happened, why did this happen. I walked in, and she was laying in the bed, in the hospital bed, and she was just not responding. Her eyes were closed. They were working on her needles, IVs, all this kind of thing. And there were two nurses in there. And when I walked in, one nurse said, "Are you her mom?" I said, "Yes, I am." I walked to her side, and I, not knowing what she could hear or comprehend, I put my hand on her forehead and I called her name and I said, "Ciara, mom's here. You're going to be okay." And the first nurse said, "Well, Mom, when they brought her in, she was praising Jesus." And the last I had seen her, she's in grand mal seizure, very horrible seizure. And she said she was praising Jesus. And I said, "Oh, really?" And then the other nurse that was standing there, she said, "Well, she was also singing a Jesus song." And I said, "Well, do you remember any of the words to the song?" Because I said, she's a musician and she's, sings, does music. And I said, "I would like to know what song she was singing, if you can recall any of the words." And this nurse turned around and looked at me and she said, "Oh, I know exactly the song that she was singing." And I said, "You do?" And she said, "Yeah." And she was not of the Apostolic Pentecostal faith. And she said, "We used to sing this song in my church when I was growing up, when I was a little girl. And it was that old song, Jesus, Jesus, there's just something about that name. Master, Savior, Jesus, like the fragrance after the rain." And Sister Jamie, the significance of that song is, in going back to parenting, the day Ciara was born and we brought her home from the hospital, I remember sitting in that rocking chair that night. And the song that organically came to me, I didn't plan it, was that song. That was the first lullaby. That was the first song she ever heard this mouth sing to her. And as she grew, she became a little girl growing up, that was her song. Anytime she couldn't sleep, anytime she was sick, I would sing that song to her. Jesus, Jesus, there's just something about that name. And Brother Booker preaches a message, his love is in the details. And most everybody in this world knows the song Amazing Grace, whether they go to church or not. I knew that that was a God moment because that was the very song that I had used to sing to her, to comfort her throughout her growing up years. And it's almost as if she was self-soothing when they brought her in with that song. And it was the most unbelievable moment because it was almost as if on cue, right then, she turned her head, she never opened her eyes, and she said, Sing to me, Mom. That was the first words I had heard her say since she had collapsed. And I thought, I don't care where I'm at. I'm fixing to sing. And you know what I sang? And I started singing Jesus. Jesus, there's just something about that name. And that nurse, both of those nurses, put down the instruments and everything that they had in their hands. They stopped working. It was such a holy moment. And that one nurse that said that she knew the song, do you know she sang it with me word for word till the very end? And I knew she was going to be okay. I knew it because just the way it happened. And that goes back somewhat to what we put into our children, what we put into their minds will later come out in some way. And it did. And so the next couple of days were just, she was kind of in and out of it. They did not know at that time. They had no idea what caused it. She never had heart issues, heart problems. They did every kind of test, brain scan, everything. And preachers were coming in and out, and God's people are so amazing. We had phone calls, preachers and their wives, friends driving in, would pray for her, and just no clue as to why it happened at that time. And so on Tuesday, after this had happened on Sunday night, they said, well, we're going to release you, just follow up with her physician at home. And she was conscious, talking. The last thing she remembered was the Pastor Epley, calling us up to sing. And so he has a camp meeting that he's been doing for years at his church that started on that Wednesday. We had never been. We were supposed to be home by then. But so we asked our daughter, do you want to stay and just go to church tomorrow night? And she said, I do. And so we walked into church on Wednesday night. And of course, the church, when we walked in and saw her, they knew what a miraculous thing had happened. And in the service, the pastor looked at her and he said, Ciara, can you come up here and sing? And she said, yes, I can. And my husband walked with her, and they walked over that same ramp that she had walked up on Sunday night. They got to that spot and they worshiped God together. And I tell you, it was a moment. And she walked to the keyboard and began to play and sing. And she sang that old song. The name of it is My Tribute, but the words, to God be the glory. With his blood, he has saved me. With his power, he has raised me. And she just sang that old song and stood there. And I'm telling you, sister, I don't know why it happened. As far as, when we got home, we followed up with a cardiologist, and it was like an electrical thing, apparently, or AFib, something like that. But it was just a random thing that happened. But I told her, I said, you know what? God is not going to waste this experience. He is going to use it to build faith. He's going to use it to minister to someone. And Sister Jamie, I don't know why everybody doesn't get their miracle that I realize that. But I am so grateful. And I tell you what I did when all this chaos was going on and I was watching this happen. I told the Lord, I said, God, if you will give me this miracle, I'll tell it everywhere I go, and I will give you the glory for it. I won't be shy to tell it. I don't care what people think. I don't care if people say, well, maybe she was just unconscious. No, she wasn't. There were medical personnel there on site that saw it and can testify. In fact, a couple of the nurses came up to the hospital the next day and they said, we just had to see her for ourselves because we know what happened. We know that she died. And I I've been told that some of their young people that night, their children had told their parents, made the comment, "Wow, Mom, wow, Dad, we really saw someone raised from the dead." And it really happened. I'm so grateful. I'm so thankful. Um, I remember praying in the past and as every mom does, I prayed, God, I want my daughter to experience the supernatural. I want her to know that you do heal. I want her to know that you have supernatural power. You can do anything. And he did show her. Why he chose that method, I don't know. I don't know. But she's just, she's a living testimony. And I'll, I'm so thankful. And she is so thankful. She's, you know, and has testified about it herself.
Bishop Holmes often uses the phrase, thank God I did, instead of I wish I had.
Gotcha.
And that just reminds me of that, thank God that you sang those songs and that you taught her that, because there are times that you come up against situations like that and you don't know when that's going to happen. You don't know when that's going to come. But you could be thinking, "Oh, I wish I would have took them to prayer meeting. I wish I would have, put this doctor in them. I wish all these different things," but it's too late. When
Yeah.
when tragedy strikes, you're
That's right.
either gonna say, "Thank God I did," or "I wish I had." And I know whenever she was singing that song, you had to think, "Thank God I did."
Exactly, Sister Jamie. And I just wept and wept because you just think it was worth it. It was worth it. It was worth all the, am I doing this right? Am I am I doing enough? You know, but every every situation where I would think maybe I'm overdoing it here. Maybe I'm being just silly. I've been called, oh, you're an overprotective mom, or you know, some people through the years in our church, they're not with us anymore, but say, "Oh, you think your daughter's better than anybody else because you won't let her do this." No, I don't. That's just how I feel like God wanted me to parent, and I hope that makes sense. But I believe every mom, if every young mother make conscious, intentional decisions, God will bless you for it. And you will see the fruit of it. You will see the results of it, because I certainly have. And I want to say this, there are parents that do everything right. I have some dear friends that raise their children in a wonderful, godly atmosphere, a godly home. They heard their parents pray. Saw them push back the plate and fast. But when they're adults, they have the rights to make their own decision. I know that. But how much better is it if, when they make those decisions, if they're not the right decision, we at least can rest easy at night, put our head on the pillow and say, God, I did everything that I could. I did my part. And so the rest is in your hands, God.
The encouragement that you've given us as moms today is so valuable. I'm so grateful for you pouring into us and sharing your heart, sharing your story, sharing that testimony. It has been so amazing. What is one last thing that you would want to leave with the Unashamedly You community today?
I think that would be that God really does answer prayers for wisdom. I love the verse that says, "Do any among you lack wisdom? Let him ask of God that giveth liberally and upbraideth not." I quote that, and our church knows, they've heard me say this. Sister Jamie, I quote that back to the Lord every day as if he doesn't know what's in his Bible. No, I say, now, God, you said if I lack wisdom, I could ask and you would give it. God, give me wisdom today for whatever I'm called to do, whatever I'm called to say. Give me wisdom in that moment. God gives you wisdom. That would be one thing I would say. Number two is God really does still work miracles.
He is faithful to those that are faithful to him.
Yes.
And we can trust the Lord. That's something that I often say is we can trust the Lord. Lord, I can trust you. I can trust you with my children. I can trust you to be making up where I lack. I can trust you in my marriage. I can trust the Lord, and we can. We really can trust him.
Yes, we can.
Thank you so much for being on the podcast today, Sister Johnson. It has been a high honor. You have spoke directly to me, and I know that you have spoke to so many that are listening. What a blessing it is to have you on. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Sister Jamie, for the honor.
We are at the end of 2024, and if you have not yet signed up for the free introductory coaching call, you are welcome to do that, even if you want to schedule it for January and start off 2025 on the right foot. Make sure that you head over to unashamedlyyou.com, select the coaching tab, and schedule your first session for completely free. These coaching sessions are for anyone that is wanting to start something. You guys, even if you're not sure what it looks like and you're just wanting to run some ideas by someone, that is what this calls for. Or if you've started something, but you're feeling a little stuck and you just need some help restarting those ideas and dreaming big again, I want to help you make sure that 2025 is the best year that you've ever had.